Welcome to episode 309 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Vanessa Patrick, author of The Power of Saying No. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Dr. Vanessa Patrick, the Associate Dean for Research, Executive Director of Doctoral Programs, a Bauer Professor of Marketing, and lead faculty of the Executive Women in Leadership Program at the Bauer School of Business at the University of Houston. She has been recognized with a number of awards for excellence in research, service, teaching, and inclusive design. The Marketing Science Institute named her one of the top young scholars in the field. In 2012, she was named one of the top 50 most productive marketing scholars worldwide by the American Marketing Association. She was appointed as a Fulbright specialist for 2019 through 2024. by the U.S. Department of State Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs as well. She is a regular speaker at both academic and practitioner conferences, including the Association for Consumer Research Conference, the Society of Consumer Psychology Conference, the Greater Houston Women's Chamber of Commerce Annual Conference, the NAWMBA Annual Gender Diversity Conference, and the UH Women of Color Coalition. She is currently an associate editor for the Journal of Marketing Research and the Journal of Marketing. She has served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Consumer Psychology, and the Journal of Retailing, and on the policy board of the Journal of the Association of Consumer Research. She has co-edited special issues on consumer aesthetics for the Journal of Consumer Psychology and the Journal of the Association of Consumer Research. And in case you're wondering how she has time to do so much amazing stuff, I'm guessing it's because she's gotten really good at saying no to stuff that wouldn't be amazing for her. And that is what we're talking about today, her research and how it has led to the new book, The Power of Saying No. Really quickly, before we get into the conversation, I want to be sure you know that there are links in the show notes for everything, including related past episodes, links to articles and books, including The Power of Saying No, and so much more. It's all within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/309. Now let's jump right in. Dr. Vanessa Patrick, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here.
Oh, yes. I am very, very excited to have you as well and to meet you today, having been introduced to you 2 days ago and your book came out today, and so exciting. And for everyone who doesn't yet know you, I will have talked a little bit about you in the intro, of course, but can you share a little bit about your background and the work that you do?
Right. So I'm a professor of marketing at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. I also have an administrative position. I am the associate dean for research, the executive director of our doctoral programs, and I am also the lead faculty for our Women in Leadership program. And I am the author of the new book, The Power of Saying No, the new science of how to say no that puts you in charge of your life.
Well, and how many of us struggle with saying no? I'm sure you know at least some sort of percentages in the research. Is it 100%? It's pretty close, right?
A lot of people, most people struggle with saying no. And even the people who say, I have no problem saying no, what they need to learn is how to say no more effectively. Because if you have no problem with saying no, chances are you are, burning a lot of bridges.
Right. Yeah. There's saying no and saying no in a way that makes it so people don't hate you.
Right. Exactly. That's where my book comes in.
For sure. And what I really loved in the book is, there's this balance of the fear we have of what people will say, where we feel like we have to say yes. I know I had mentioned to you a little bit in the intro, but Zoe Chance is just one of my very favorite people. She's been on the show talking about her book, Influence is Your Superpower. And we talked a lot about, how she has her students do their 24 hours of no and the importance of like asking, because people are inclined to say yes, and then getting a little bit more comfortable with saying no to things and realizing it's not as bad as it may seem. And I love how much more, you really dig in. Of course, it's a whole book just on saying no. Instead of, one piece in a book. But, we're really worried about what might happen, and we kind of build it up to the exact and do the exact opposite of what can actually be effective, right?
Yes. We have these dual drivers that make us say yes when we want to say no. One is a concern for our relationships with the asker. We want to be liked. We want to be part of a social group. We want to have friends. And we think that by saying yes, we are more likely to secure that relationship with the asker. The other thing that we care about is being seen as competent. Our reputation is super important. And so the other reason we say yes when we want to say no is because we want people to think good things about us. When we leave the room, we want them to say that we are completely capable people who can take on more and more and more. And that person who can take on more and more and more and do everything well, I've never met that person. That person does not exist.
Right. Well, and I love the example, from the book of saying like you don't want to be the kind of pushover person where it's like, oh, ask Melina, she'll do anything. Like
yes.
People don't respect that in the same way either, right? Like,
yeah. And so there are people who, unfortunately, because they become these people who say yes to everything, they become the go-to person for everything that everyone wants. But what happens then is that you are unable to develop your own set of unique skills and be known for your unique competence. You are just known as the jack of all trades, as opposed to, the master of a certain set of things that you very strategically say yes to.
For sure. But it's hard, right? Well, I'm curious to see. So, and for everyone listening, I think they'll be intrigued to know, you share a story at the beginning of the book of at least one instance that got you interested in saying yes when you wish you could say no. Is that the only thing that really drove you to this idea of studying the power of no and why you should say no and why we say yes? Or is there more to it?
There's a lot to it. I mean, the motivating story was something that happened many, many years ago. And since then, of course, you realize that this is a really important area. My first work in this space was actually the ability to say no to yourself in terms of self-discipline. So the research started in the domain of studying how do you say no to temptation? How do you resist temptation and use self-talk in a way that helps you steer yourself away from the temptation and towards your goals. And so that work on self-talk was the first research that I published on saying no. And it's kind of a different reframe because temptation is very often looked at as the balance between desire and willpower. And one of the things that boosts our willpower is how we think about things, how we talk to ourselves, and how we diminish the desire of temptation by that self-talk. And that's kind of the way I conceptualize this idea of empowered refusal, saying no to yourself. And then in an extension of that paper, looked at it in an interpersonal context. And to be honest, Melina, I don't think that when I studied this at the beginning, I realized how important it was. It was only after I published these papers, and then the phone kept ringing with everybody wanting to know, the press essentially saying, there were all these articles from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, radio shows, all sorts of things, largely about this problem. And that's the first time I realized, oh goodness, this issue is really something that people struggle with and want to know more about. And fast forward about 8 years later, we have a book. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and of course, congratulations again on the book. And in reading your book, so I have done an article for Inc. That I wrote about self-talk in like first person versus third person for motivating ourselves based on some research that I didn't like personally know the authors, but just had grabbed the research. So potentially that's your paper that you're talking about?
I'm not sure. I haven't read your Inc. article, but it could be.
I know it might be, right? It could have been some of your work and definitely some of the don't versus can't.
Yes.
I've written stuff about that as well, which I believe is your research, right?
That is definitely mine. Yes.
Yeah.
That is
I have cited and talked about it often and didn't know it was you. So I love when that works out. So I too have written and shared about it. And for everyone who hasn't read those articles yet or heard about this, can you share a little bit about some of that don't versus can't?
Yeah. So it's basically a very simple kind of reframing of how you say no. So instead of saying I can't, using the words I can't, which signals deprivation, signals to the asker that under other circumstances that you would like to, but you are not able to. Those are all the connotations of can't. But when you say I don't, you come across as much more empowered, much more in the driver's seat of your own life, way more in control, convincing, determined. And so this, when you want to frame your refusal, shifting from I can't to I don't makes a world of difference. So if I tell you, for example, I can't eat chocolate cake or I can't go out tonight, you're going to be like, why? That's the first thing. And you enter and you almost invite a negotiation. Whereas when you want to say no, you don't want to enter into a negotiation with the asker. You want to say a firm and decisive no so that you don't get pushback and you can move on from that topic. Essentially, that's the most effective no.
And I know that you talk about it in the book, and one of the ways I've talked about it before too is and I think that it's from the original research, right? I can't skip workouts and I don't skip workouts, right?
Yes.
And it feels, it's one word, it's, 2 letters. It shouldn't be that big of a difference. And yet, when you say, oh, I can't do this, I guess, it just primes and sets you up to want to break the rules a little bit. We don't like being put in that box where as saying, well, I don't do that thing, the end.
You've made a decision. You have a personal policy about it, and you're much more in control. And that language signals to yourself as well as to others that this is a firm stance that you are taking on the matter.
So when people do ask us to do things, so we of course get asks from all sorts of areas. We get asks from people we're very close to, friends, family members, bosses. We have asks from peripheral type people and asks from people we're never ever going to see again. Does it matter? How does it come into play? I, of course, know some of the answer, but how does this tie in with the way we say no?
Yeah. This is what I call the acquaintance trap. So essentially what I show and argue is that it's very easy for us to say no to a complete stranger who we will never see again. You can say no. It's completely transactional. Never going to see them again. No problem. It's also easy to say no to people who you're close to because you have a secure relationship with them and your reputation is not likely to be damaged. So it's okay to say no to like your mom or your sister because they'll get over it and it's fine. They'll be fine. The vast majority of people, however, fall into the bucket of acquaintances. We know them somewhat, people we work with, neighbors, neighborhood friends, community. And those are people that we want to be seen in a good light. We want to have positive relationships with them. We want them to think we are nice. And so these are the people we struggle with saying no the most.
And it feels like we're I don't want to say the bulk of the asks come from, but you get a lot of asks from people maybe expect a lot from you. And but is the advice different, I guess, as we look at saying no for people? Like, where do we start? I know that you've got your, the empowered refusal that comes up, but as you talk to people about saying no, and everybody that's listening, like, yes, what do I do? How do I say no? What do you tell them?
Yeah. So I identify these 3 competencies that we need to develop in order to be able to say an effective no. The art of empowered refusal. ART is the acronym. A stands for awareness. R stands for rules, not decisions. And T stands for totality of self. And so what I argue and propose in the book is that we have to really invest to be able to say an empowered refusal. I don't do something. It needs to stem from your identity and a place of self-awareness. So you do have to invest in yourself, in understanding, what do I uniquely want to bring to the table? What is it that I'm good at? What is it that I want to steer clear of? What are the things I want to prioritize? What do I believe in? So these are questions that we need to spend some time reflecting on so that we can build some personal policies on them. So personal policies are these simple rules that we set up for ourselves that guide our actions and decisions. And with this deepened self-awareness, we can then set ourselves up with these rules so that when we are in a situation, we have a rule in place. So for example, instead of, let's say you want to give up sugar, right? You want to eat less sugar. Instead of making a decision each and every time you look at a menu that you don't want to eat dessert or you are going to skip the salad dressing, you can set up personal policies that give voice to that decision of wanting to eat less sugar. You can just be somebody who says, I don't eat salad dressing, I don't eat desserts during the week, things like that. And so in behavioral science, we talk about that. One form in which we can talk about that is in terms of mental budgets, right? So mental budgets are these quotas that we give ourselves. It helps us stick with what we desire to achieve. So research has shown that mental budgets are a form of a self-regulatory device. We can set our quota and say, I'm going to walk, 8,000 steps a day. And so you just do that because you have a quota and you're going to make sure you achieve that quota. So personal policy is very similar in that regard. And it has to come from that deepened self-awareness that you can identify what that is and then set you up for that sort of success.
Right. And is that where it's easier to stick to if you understand the why behind it?
Absolutely. It's so much easier to because what it says is I'm the kind of person who does this, right? I'm the kind of person who doesn't take calls between 6 and 8 in the evening. I'm the kind of person who doesn't touch their phone when they're in the car. I'm the kind of person who takes the elevator or takes the stairs instead of the elevator. So it's like the kind of person you are, and you use that sort of language that allows you to say no more effectively. And you can do this, we've talked a lot about personal examples, but you can do this when you're working on a project team and working with other people as well. And a lot of examples that come up in the research that come about how you can be more efficient at work if you set yourself up with these rules.
Yeah. So, speaking of work, of course, bringing the business here into the Brainy Business. So what about the asks from, we want to say no to, and it's different when it's your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss,
Yes.
or even a coworker, so what advice do you have for people? And they don't have to be in a fully toxic work environment, but you still may potentially get some asks that aren't great. And if you've always been that people pleaser, I know this comes up too, what do you do?
Right. And so one of the things I do in the book is I present a framework to help people decipher the ask, because it's really important to figure out what asks to say yes to and what asks to say no to. There are some asks in organizations that you just gotta do because they are urgent and important and they just gotta be done. If you're on a spaceship and you need to do something or else the spaceship is going to crash to the ground. That's not the time for empowered refusal. That's the time for action and doing what needs to be done, right? But so there are those kind of high risk, very important, urgent situations where you are better off cooperating in the moment. I'm not talking about those kind of asks in my book. I'm talking about asks which are regular asks that are not part of your job that you are taking on because you simply don't know how to get out of them. Right? So, some researchers talked about these asks as non-promotable tasks. They are not part of your job and they do not contribute to your advancement in the organization. So in organizations, there are lots of things that just need to be done. They are not assigned to anybody in terms of a job responsibility, but they got to be done. So someone's got to do them. And it turns out, unfortunately, that the same people end up doing those kind of non-promotable tasks. So Linda Babcock and her colleagues do this research on non-promotable tasks. And these are tasks like bringing the coffee for a meeting, taking the notes of a meeting, organizing retirement parties and stuff like that, which are good to do, but it shouldn't be the only thing you spend all your time doing because that's not why you were employed by the firm. Right? And so you have to be thinking about what are the trade-offs associated with me taking on all these extra tasks and how is that impacting the work that I need to get done? And it turns out that women are 44% more likely to be asked to do non-promotable tasks. And they are 76% more likely to say yes when asked compared to 51% of men. And so if you look around and think about, a lot of community events, things that charity events, a lot of them are run by women because women are taking on these responsibilities to do things that are unpaid and not necessarily associated with advancement. And so what I advocate for is that by all means, you should participate in non-promotable tasks, but make sure that you are not the only one, right? You want to be a contributor, but you don't want to be the only one doing that. There has to be a system in place where you take turns doing it. Everybody gets a chance to do those things. And then it's fair because those things have to be done.
Right. You don't want to be the default for all the
Yes.
slush tasks. Right?
Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of people find themselves in those situations and they feel extremely resentful and frustrated that is how they are spending their time. And that's not a good thing. It's those kinds of asks that we have to be careful of.
It's interesting because I think some people really do something along the lines of planning the party. Right? Mm-hmm. They may actually like and get some enjoyment out of that. And while it's not part of their job, they think it's fun and other people, it's part of their personal brand in a way that it's providing some value for them. And they do maybe get to be seen by some higher ups where they might not have otherwise. And there could be some value in that. But other people hate that. And it's kind of the of course I have to plan the party because I'm a woman sort of a thing, right? Where if that's how you feel about it or how it's come across, find a way to say no to the thing that you hate doing, right?
Yeah.
And so for the people that are planning the party, find a way to say no to maybe taking the notes, right? So you don't end up doing everything.
You're so right, because that's one of the things I talk about in the book. Everybody needs to find the tasks. We want to create workplaces and environments where everyone is doing the stuff that they are best at and enjoy the most. You're going to get the most productive and happy work environment if people are tapped in to do things that leverage their strengths. And if you are doing stuff that you really hate and you are doing them because you don't know how to say no to them, that's that's where you start needing to develop this no muscle and practice empowered refusal.
Yeah. I know that there's another nuance that can come up, we'll talk about it in the work context and, really any way that it wants to present itself as you answer. But, even people that say, oh, I'm really good at saying no, I don't have to worry about it. But that might be, you're maybe forgetting you're focusing on areas where you're confident saying no. And I bet there's somewhere that you struggle, right? Most people are not good at saying no in all aspects of their life under all circumstances, no matter what, right? So there's the solo ask and the social, where you get a lot of that herding instincts coming up, and the social proof where someone says, "Oh, well, Melina will do that, right?"
Right.
And everybody turns and looks at you. Do you answer differently than when it's just a one-on-one ask?
So obviously it's harder. It's harder to say no when everyone is looking at you and expecting you to answer with a positive yes. In fact, I call that the stadium proposal, right? So in the book, I talk about the fact that, we have this jumbotron in our mind. It's like we are being proposed to at a stadium with 10,000 people watching, and we have no choice but to say yes. And sometimes in these environments where a lot of people are just expecting you to say yes, it's really much harder. And so I come up with strategies to kind of diffuse that stadium proposal moment, diffuse the spotlight that we are experiencing. It's easier to say no when you are in a one-on-one, and it's easier in a one-on-one if it's not face-to-face. So if you can bring technology as a mediator between you and the asker, it's just easier to say no when you've got technology mediating that conversation. We are 34 times more likely to say yes to a face-to-face request. So
Whoa.
So it's a good idea if you're someone who doesn't know how to say no. It's a good idea to kind of make that conversation a digital one.
To never be in a room with anyone ever.
Or learn how to navigate it, right? With the empowered refusal.
You're right. Yeah, for sure. And again, if you're someone that has a hard time asking other people to do things and you always do things, we can learn, the flip of this as well, right? That if you ask in person, you're more likely.
We have to remember that an ask is not a requirement. A request is not a requirement. It is a request. And you have to also remember that you are not rejecting the asker. You are rejecting the ask. We are not rejecting the person. We are rejecting what they're asking us to do. And once we kind of reframe that in our own mind, it becomes easier. I don't want to do this. That's fine. It's not that you're rejecting the person who's asking you. And we very often, for some reason, I think it's because we are socialized to be much more compliant. When people ask you something or invite you to go somewhere or ask you for a favor, they are generally expecting a yes. And so saying no goes against that expectation, that social contract. And so we need to kind of reframe that social contract so that we think about the fact that this is not a rejection of the other person. This is really about that task or that particular ask. And it changes quite a bit when you think about it that way.
Yeah. And you touched a little bit on something here that I think people might have a question about. Is it better to have a reason or to not have a reason? And I think in this case, we hear reason as, that's a fancy way to say excuse, right?
Right. So having a reason that stems from your identity or something that matters to you is a valid and strong reason and strong way to communicate your no. What most of the time what happens, Melina, is that we reach for the first excuse that we can find and we grab onto that and give that to the asker. And it turns out that excuses They don't have the kind of power. They are weak arguments, essentially, for saying no, compared to a personal policy or an identity-based no, which is a much more strong argument and hence more persuasive. I did a study in which I told people that they were going to ask someone for money. So they needed $5,000 to put down a down payment on some condo, and they went and asked a friend. And the friend either gave them an excuse and said something like, oh, I really can't right now because I have my own expenses and I have to pay this and I have to do that. Or they basically gave them a personal policy, which is, I don't loan money to friends and family. That's my policy. That's my rule. So either excuse or rule. It turns out that in the short run, you have to go away. You accept that excuse. You accept that personal policy. What happens, however, is, so we ask them, if you have this need for money again 5 years from now, would you go back to this friend? As you might imagine, because the rule was permanent, you're not going to go back because that person has said, I don't lend money to friends and family. This is a rule today. It's a rule 5 years from now, 20 years from now. Whereas an excuse like I can't because I have to pay this and I have to do that is temporary. It's situational. And so obviously 5 years from now, that excuse doesn't exist. The door is still left open. You're quite likely to go back and ask that person. And I think that that's the power of personal policies versus excuses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And again, like you said, taking the time to choose what your personal policies are makes it so they're easier to hold to, because it's not like everything it's not like you're going to say no to everything that anyone ever asks you for the rest of your life, right? But
no, of course
if you have the lines that are drawn and say, like, this is just an easy no. It's kind of in the, Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg wearing the same thing every day of like not having to think about it makes it easier to do everything else.
Yes. So I have a framework in the book, which is to help people decipher the ask. And it talks about two main criteria. The first criterion is, how costly is this to you? If I say yes, how costly is it to you? And then the other criteria is, how much will it benefit the asker? What impact can I have in the world if I did this, right? And so the first type of asks, I'll give you a couple of examples. The first kind of ask is, this easy ask, which is, I call it the pass the salt ask. So imagine there's a salt shaker sitting in front of you and someone says, hey, Vanessa, can you pass the salt? And you just pick it up and you give the salt. That's easy. It's low cost for you and potentially high benefit for the person because they really wanted the salt and you passed it along. So that was great. So pass the salt asks are good to say yes to because they are low cost to you, but you can benefit the other person immensely. As a professor, I look at recommendation letters, for example, writing recommendation letters. It's a pass the salt sort of ask because I have a system in place on how to write a recommendation letter, how long it takes. If this is a student that needs it and can get into college or master's program based on that recommendation letter, it's a game changer for them. And so those are pass the salt asks. The kind of asks that are the ones to beware of are what I call bake your famous lasagna asks. They are the careless asks. They are the asks they have no real impact on the world, but they are hugely costly for you. So the example I give in the book is a friend is having a potluck and says, hey, you're so great at baking the lasagna. I loved it the last time I ate it. Why don't you bring that to the potluck? And you're stuck because you don't know how to navigate that. And that is how you need to spot bake your famous lasagna ask, because essentially it is a potluck, which means everyone is going to buy store-bought cookies and store-bought salads, and you would have slaved over the lasagna for a few hours at least. And so those are the kind of asks that you need to be the most careful of. They do not have a unique impact. They're not going to make a difference in the world, no dent in the universe because you did them. And they are hugely costly for you. So you need to spot those asks and obviously say no to bake your famous lasagna asks. And then, of course, the asks that I like to say yes to are what I call hero's journey asks, which are both, they might be costly for you. They might be things that you have to invest in, but also they make a difference to the world. So they are worth doing. And so we want to say no to the bake your famous lasagna ask because that gives us the time to do the hero's journey asks. So I think one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the issue of trade-offs and opportunity costs, right? So when you are faced with an ask, you have to think about, if I say yes to this one thing, what am I saying no to? And that's the opportunity cost that you have to evaluate. And when we think about opportunity cost, we definitely realize the importance of saying no.
For sure. And I know you talk about it in the book, and it's probably a concept most people have heard before, but everything you say yes to means you're saying no to everything else, that you could have done in that time, right?
Exactly. And, we do have a phenomenon in the literature, which was just called opportunity cost neglect, which is people in general don't often think about opportunity cost of the things that they are saying yes to. And so you have to kind of intentionally do that. You have to build opportunity cost calculations into your decision making because it's not something that happens naturally.
One of the things that I really loved, one of the many things I really loved in the book, and I have so many quotes kind of written down, and I've been like holding back and trying to not jump into too many of them for you. But, this idea of, being empowered to make a decision, and it can feel like it's something that's really selfish. We can feel like we're being selfish when we say no, and that those two things, kind of have to go together in this way. But I think it's so important how you share that that's not even just not necessarily the case, but really that the opposite can actually be true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you have to think about the fact that it's not selfish to say no to things that don't matter to you, that don't leverage your unique strengths, that don't create the impact in the world that you want to have. In fact, I think it's pretty selfish of people to ask you to do that. So if you turn it around and see a pushy asker who's demanding that you do something that you don't want to do, that person is the one being selfish, not the person who's saying no to the ask. And we've talked about the fact that, society favors the asker. So it's like it feels in many cases that the asker, because they asked, should get the yes answer. And why should that be? We can think about it and say, well, you're being selfish asking me to do something that is not up my alley. It is my right to say no to those asks.
Thank you so much for that advice. I think it is important for people to know that it's not being selfish to say no. It's actually, it can be valuable to others when you do take that time to say no, and that your book has so many amazing tips for people that goes deeper into the language, helping them to understand how to do these things. Like, so where you're listening going, yeah, but what do I do with my boss when they ask, or how do I overcome this? Of course, there are lots of tips for you in the book, which will be linked in the show notes. And for more on that, Vanessa, what's the best way for everyone who's now really excited to learn more from you, to connect? Where should they go? What should they do?
So my website is vanessapatrick.net. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and can easily be found on those channels, social media channels.
Perfect. Well, we will again share those links in the show notes. And thank you so much again for saying yes to joining me on the show today.
Of course. Thank you so much, Melina.
Thank you again to Dr. Vanessa Patrick for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? For me, I really enjoyed reading The Power of Saying No and the insights Vanessa shared both there and in our conversation today. There is, of course, so much more within the book that's helpful for perpetual yesers like myself. Now, I know that I don't have to label myself as such. Vanessa talks in the book about the power priming and how you don't want to say you're a people pleaser or give yourself a label that'll keep you stuck in a role like this when you want to change. She references Dr. Jonah Berger and his work from Magic Words, something he just talked with me on the show a couple of weeks ago in episode 301. She also references so many amazing people who've been guests on the show, like Vanessa Bonds, who wrote You Have More Influence Than You Think, and Robert Cialdini, author of Influence and Persuasion. And we, of course, have to thank Dilip Soman, who wrote Behavioral Science in the Wild, who made the introduction to Vanessa and suggested I interviewed her for the show. So definitely thank you, Dilip, for that. And yes, of course, links to all those past episodes and books are waiting for you in the show notes. A couple of other little tidbits I had made notes about while I was reading, but we didn't have a chance to get into in our conversation today. One of the things Vanessa talks about is thinking about the ask someone is bringing to you as a big pile of garbage. And let's face it, a lot of asks are. So if someone were to call it like it is and ask, hey, can I put my giant pile of garbage on your desk? You probably wouldn't have much of a problem saying no, right? And then what would they do? They'd probably move on to the next person and ask them, and the next, until someone eventually says yes. It may feel like the end of the world to say no, but often the asker doesn't necessarily expect you're going to say yes, and they're already ready to move on to the next person. If their ask isn't about you, your no doesn't have to be about them. This is where things really get good in the power of saying no. All those tips to do it in a way that will make it so the person you're saying no to won't hate you. This is accomplished with the empowered refusal, something Vanessa talks all about in the book, of course. One of my favorite quotes from the book says, empowered refusal is a way of saying no that effectively conveys your stance based on your values, preferences, and priorities. When you do that, people are often more understanding. Don't make excuses. Don't be wishy-washy. Don't talk about how you might be interested next time to make it easier today. Own those no's. You'll really be surprised at how well it can work out when you do. And Vanessa, of course, is here to support you in her amazing book, The Power of Saying No. I look forward to trying these skills along with you. As I said, I'm someone who wants to do all the things and help all the people, so I, like most humans, have struggled with saying no over the years and still have lots to learn. So please do share your top insights and wins with us. We would love to hear them. I am the Brainy Biz on all the socials and Melina Palmer on LinkedIn. Vanessa is vpatrick23 on Twitter. Links to all our handles and other ways to connect are waiting for you in the show notes, along with related past episodes and books, including The Power of Saying No, You Have More Influence Than You Think, Influence, Behavioral Science in the Wild, and Magic Words. It's all waiting for you in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/309. And thank you again to Dr. Vanessa Patrick for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me Tuesday for another brainy episode of the Brainy Business Podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.